how can the non-Western countries anti-US axis try to sort of weaken the US dollar dominance? Well, it's just not possible. I'm not going to start turning this into a Bitcoin discussion, but there are some people who like to push the idea of CBDCs and crypto.
No, I think it's totally possible. You need to be big enough as an economy to do it. So I think the only country that can viably do it at the moment is China. And some of these initiatives like mBridge or BRICS Bridge or the central bank digital currency initiatives that go around sort of the correspondent banking model, which means that sort of the US has all of these private banks. Basically, like the dollar system is very much a private currency system that of course relies on support from the Fed and other central banks, but it's very much private sort of. That will be a first step, and they're already doing that. So for investability, they need to open their capital account, as you said. That meaning that you should be able to invest in Chinese stock markets easily, and crucially, you should be able to get your money out again easily as well.
This is The Global Gambit.
All right, guys, it's part 2, and we're back with Joeri Schasfoort, who is, he's one of my favorite channels, as I said at the beginning of part 1, and someone who's actually properly educated and trained and qualified in economics to comment on these matters. And we had a good, I think, quite very broad-ranging conversation about globalization, and we ended it talking about China, and I left that cliffhanger because we're going to touch upon China even more in the latter half of this part 2. But initial question I had for you, Joeri, was about, you mentioned earlier on in part 1 about economic blocs, and one of the things that I think is quite interesting about the European Union specifically is that we are seeing a growing divergence. You're based in Belgium at the moment. I'm in London. Not that I would like us to be separate from Europe, but we've got countries that are sort of more populist, and then we've got countries which are more dominated by, shall we say, establishment or traditional political entities. And we had the European Parliament elections earlier this year, and that showed a significant rise in alternative votes, such as in the Netherlands, such as in France, such as in Sweden, although that was on the left. And obviously we've got Hungary and similar. So I was very interested to learn a little bit about your views of Europe as a bloc, because we had the report from Mario Draghi come out, and he was talking about what the EU needs to do to become more economically competitive again. Because at the moment, productivity is down. Economic forecasts for the European economy have been around 0.5% growth, 1% if we're lucky. Can you take us through a little bit how you look at Europe at the moment?
Yeah, I have a bit of a controversial take on this, I think, or at least.
Goody.
It goes against the mainstream narrative. Let's go. No, the thing is, I think Europe is very competitive. It's not gotten less competitive, although it has gotten less competitive, I think, in very flashy or visible sectors like the tech sector. I'm not going to argue that Europe is very competitive in the tech sector, and the tech sector this happens to become very important and has grown a lot. So I'm not going to say that, but I think if you look at the Draghi report, he makes the case that we've gotten far less productive. But if you look at, for example, or especially compared to America, right? That's a key point he makes. And to China, but China has just grown a lot. But if you compare to America, if you look at the share of trade in goods and services that Europe has, if we look at just how much they export, it has declined a little bit, but similarly, it has declined in a similar manner to the United States. At least if we look at it in terms of goods and services. Raw goods and services. So I think the key there is that I have argued in one of my videos that if you want to understand sort of Europe and Japan also sort of staying behind or falling behind the United States, you have to look at what the US dollar has done and what prices in the United States have done. So the key sort of concept that we used in international economics to compare economies is dollar term GDP, which I think in many cases is the right metric to use. I use it all the time. If we talk about small open economies that rely on the US dollar, or if we talk about geopolitics where sort of if you want to support a war somewhere, you need dollars, right? So the US dollar is the global currency, so it's super important in many cases. But I think if you look at competitiveness and how well people are doing, which may sort of tie into the whole populist narrative. Yes, populism is popular in Europe, but I'd argue that it's more popular in the United States in the sense that sort of they can get a majority populist party, right? Like Donald Trump is very much as populist as Meloni in Italy, I think. And that's strange, right? Like if we assume, I'm not sure if this is entirely true, I'm not a political scientist, but if we assume that a lot of support for populist parties comes from economic sort of woes, or the life of people getting harder, and that's something I think that's definitely the case for many, then it's really strange that the economy of America is supposedly doing so well, and yet people are so unhappy about the economy, and people are supporting populism there on a massive scale. Often with the argument that the economy is doing terribly, is not doing well for people. So what I did then in one of my videos is to go, what happens if we look at GDP on a purchasing power parity basis? That is, we look at GDP in terms of goods and services rather than GDP in terms of the US dollar. And then I think you'll find that Europe, corrected for the fact that they have had a less favorable demography than the United States, have really they're poorer than the US. It's always been the case, but they've not gotten much poorer. If we look at PPP GDP, the United States economy is not doing way better than Europe's or Japan's economy. And I think that's the relevant metric because Europe is just such a huge economy, as is the United States, that they mainly trade amongst themselves, right? Just as the United States, the states mainly trade amongst themselves. And therefore, I think if you look at the dollar-based exchange rate, it will not reflect the quality of life or the quality of the economy that people are experiencing. It's still important in other ways. It will reflect sort of the life of elite individuals in a very sort of globally minded individuals in one of these economies. Like rich people in the US have definitely gotten way richer than rich people in Europe. But I suspect that the rise of the US dollar, the US dollar has gotten way more valuable compared to the euro in the last 20 years or something, right? And yet, inflation in Europe has been way lower than it has been in the United States for a long time. Now, that is, exactly the opposite to sort of the standard economic theory, which states that if you have a lot of inflation in a currency, look at Venezuela, then the value of that currency vis-a-vis a low inflation currency should go down. But instead, what we've seen is that we've seen more inflation in the United States, so life has gotten more expensive. And yet the US dollar has appreciated vis-a-vis the euro. And so I think that in dollar terms, I'm not going to deny that the US economy has done really well. But I suspect that from the perspective of most, these economies have sort of been relatively similar in how they've done. And that could explain why Europeans are not perhaps super happy about their economies and voting for populists, but they're not more unhappy than Americans are and voting for populists more than Americans are, right? So that's my somewhat controversial take on the divergence between
and I think
the
just
US
to put it in the here and now a little bit. Just as today Reuters reported that the ECB or European Central Bank is actually beginning to debate whether interest rates need to be lowered enough to start stimulating the broader economy. Because there's been years of economic restriction but to your point, it depends what metrics you're measuring. But I'm a little bit interested in your thoughts on Europe as a collective economic entity, because one of the biggest problems, which was obviously illustrated best in the sovereign debt crisis of 2011-12, is that you have very different economies with very different needs. And some countries need more, shall we say, expanding fiscal policy. Others need more contractual. How do we balance this? Because the only way really to do it doesn't work in its current structure, right, if you're going to have a centralized monetary policy, but individual governments still being able to choose what they do with their own fiscal policies, then you're going to constantly have this sort of hit and miss. So either the EU has to centralize more and become more and more like a United States of Europe, or you have to dilute some of that monetary policy back to the national governments. So I'm curious how you think the European Union can sort of navigate this and create some kind of sustained solution.
Yeah, it's tricky. Yeah, so what you're referring to is a very well-known, is sort of based on a very well-known theory in economics called optimal currency area, where the idea is that you have these mini economies should be very similar to each other for to be in one currency area. And the logic is very sound, and I think we've seen in the euro crisis for sure that that could have played a big role. But I do think that many times since the euro crisis, economists or any other experts have predicted a return of the euro crisis, and so far we've always been surprised to the upside, right? And on top of that, right after the euro crisis, the euro became less popular, and you've seen sort of the countries ranging from Denmark to the UK sort of celebrating like, okay, at least we didn't join the euro. But if we look at Eastern European countries, we're now seeing again a move in the opposite direction. So, for example, I think Bulgaria is scheduled to join the euro next year, and Croatia joined it very not that long ago.
I think it was May last year.
Yeah, okay. And I actually spoke to the governor of Croatia's central bank, and he said, look, what's been very surprising to many is that, during COVID, we have been shielded from some of the worst effects, far more than sort of some of our neighbors that have had their own currency. And, they, of course, they have maybe some incentive to say this as well. But they said, actually, the euro has not been bad to us so far, and not in a massive crisis moment in any case. And that could also partially be because the Europeans have introduced some measures, like, for example, these European investment funds that have doled out quite a lot of cash during the COVID crisis. And so maybe they have found somewhat of a way, at least, to mitigate some of the worst sort of drawbacks of being in this collective currency. And so, yeah, I'm more optimistic than I was during the euro crisis about how sustainable the euro is. Of course, we'll still have to see. There are plenty of tests coming up. But what we've seen so far also is that sort of the Europe, this is a fairly common phrase. I think Europe has been forged in these crises. The same happened, I think, in the United States, where they've had several crises, and then they've always come out on top and in a more integrated way. And perhaps we'll see that with Europe and the euro as well. And perhaps they can even use some of the difference of their economic structure. That is, yes, you could say, hey, it should be better for governments all to be run the same. And if one government is run sort of more poorly than others, then you'll see capital and people fleeing to another one. So I don't know, people fleeing and money fleeing from Italy to Germany, for example. But that also provides an example, an incentive for the Italian government to do better. So perhaps this could also, lead to a more sustainable outcome. I'm a little bit torn. So I'm not saying that your story is completely wrong, right? I'm just saying that what you're saying is one theory is based on optimal currency areas. It's valid. I've used it in my classes. I think it was extremely valid during the euro crisis. But I think since then, the Europeans have done more than we give them credit for. The euro is now more popular than we thought. It held up really well during the COVID crisis. I'm not
Good point.
entirely sure whether that is sustainable, but I'm also not entirely sure that it's unsustainable.
such
To
a
end
good
it in a very vague
academic.
way. Sorry about that. But
No, a very good academic answer there. Sort of, well, it depends sort of answer. No, I mean, I of course, no, things have changed since 2012, where, it's a long time ago, although I don't like to say that because I was, 19 at the time. So I like to consider myself still a kid. But what about this idea? I think it was a couple of even days ago, the Dutch government have been pushing this idea of mini Schengen areas, right? Now, obviously, freedom of movement is a bit different in terms of goods and services, but the idea that you do have groups of countries that have more similar work patterns, approaches. You've got the Benelux countries, you've got the Nordic states, you've got the southern countries. And so do you think that sort of whilst the EU could obviously remain in its entirety, you might see a natural sort of balkanization, if that's the right word to use, within the EU, sort of sub zones where certain economic activity is prioritized between certain nations, or that's not practical under the current circumstances? There's a lot of speculation there, I know.
I don't know what they will do. There's a very hard right government in the Netherlands. It's very controversial. Will they set a trend? I cannot deny that there are now. Germany is also setting border checks. So it's a worrying development. Is it a reaction to sort of a temporary migrant resurgence, or is it a bigger trend? I think it's too early to tell. Of course, if we go back to the Draghi report, at least in Europe, in the European Commission, there's still a very big drive to do the opposite. They are saying sort of we have not completed the internal market, and I can actually attest to that. I've moved from the Netherlands to Belgium. It was not as seamless as I would have thought. It was definitely easier than moving to the UK after Brexit, of course, but it was still. These nations are still quite sort of balkanized in that way. And there's a lot of room for improvement. But if there's the political will to actually do that, that's too difficult for me to say as an economist.
Oh, I got to challenge you a little bit on that political economy there, Joeri. But yeah. All right. So I'd like to shift a little bit more to BRICS, because at the time of recording, 33 nations, I believe, including the several new members of the BRICS, from Ethiopia to Egypt, Saudi Arabia to Iran, are meeting in Kazan, Russia. And we're not going to go into the politics of it. If people are interested, they can come and listen to me talk about the BRICS, because I'll be doing a review of the summit in a couple of days. And also just because I love talking about it. And I'm generally thinking of doing my own PhD in BRICS, because I think it's a fascinating example of how countries are trying to sort of usurp the US-led order. But one of the biggest issues around that is the dollar. And from your perspective, I'm very interested to hear what you think about Putin's idea of trying to really push for a more sort of bilateral and set of digital-based currencies that their respective central banks could administer. Because there is a lot of talk about this. It's mainly about trying to circumnavigate sanctions. And I want to have a little back and forth with you about sanctions after this question, but sort of, how feasible is this idea of the BRICS to not necessarily completely replace the dollar, but reduce the dependency of it in the short to medium term?
Yeah, so I like to think about sort of how useful a currency is as a global currency, and on sort of three dimensions. So the first is tradability. So can you use it easily to trade with others? The dollar is super easy, of course. If you're in a pound currency zone, I'm in the euro currency zone. Both of us have very easy access to a dollar-based account. We could, do a transaction very, very easily in US dollars. A second sort of variable that I take into account is investability. Like if you pay me in dollars, then I don't want to hold it in my bank account typically, because there's a very low interest rate on that. Or at least if you pay me well, I'd like to invest it, right? And especially becomes really relevant on the scale of countries, like how the United Arab Emirates has these huge sort of excess dollar reserves, right? So The US dollar is amazing because it's very easy for countries to access these deep capital markets to store their money. And then the third sort of variable that I take into account is liquidity. Like if you get in trouble, like Sri Lanka did, for example, can you get extra units of that currency easily? And the dollar has all of these sort of institutions, like the IMF, that can lend in dollars. There's also big sort of private parties, big Gulf states that lend in dollars. But very crucially, the United States is running a current account trade deficit, or a current account deficit or trade deficit for a very long time, meaning that through trade it is sending dollar liquidity into the world. And therefore there is this very popular strategy amongst developing countries to grow by exporting, and hence sort of hoarding these dollars in this very safe way, because if you get them through exports, you're not vulnerable to investor sentiment at all. And sort of based on these characteristics, I think the dollar is still the only currency in the world that is viable as an international currency. The euro may come close a little bit, but they still have this risk, going back to our discussion of a Eurozone breakup, reducing their investability by a lot. Also, they are not running a current account deficit, or at least not consistently, so they don't have the liquidity as much as the US dollar. And any BRIC competitor has none of that, right? Like the yuan is the biggest one. Russia uses the yuan now a lot for trading. Like if we go back to this tradability variable, they use it now a lot for that. But actually there are now reports that they have these yuan shortages, and they've resorted in some areas to doing sort of barter trade again with countries like India, for example, because they just can't get in their hands on enough yuans because they're running a huge trade deficit with China. Any BRICS sort of currency will be, if we talk about optimal currency zones, the BRICS is very far from that. Will be very hard to create a BRICS currency. Like, look at how difficult it was to create the euro. And these are countries that are geographically close, politically close. India and China are sometimes literally fighting. So good luck with creating one currency. So I don't think there's a serious threat to the US dollar from any of the BRICS alternatives, sort of on the whole. But that being said, their latest initiative called, I think, BRICS Bridge, named after a currency by the Bank for International Settlements, or a currency sort of system, trading system, central bank digital currency system, actually, called mBridge, that the Bank for International Settlements has been creating together with People's Bank of China and some other mainly Asian central banks. There are now rumors of the Chinese sort of using that technology to potentially help the Russians to set up the BRICS bridge, which is basically like a clearing platform for payments between BRICS countries. And that could totally work, I think. It's just that it's only sort of, if we go back to these variables, tradability, investability, liquidity, that's only focusing on the tradability aspect. And that's important because, if you get hit by financial sanctions from the United States, trading is very painful, that you cannot use the dollar anymore. So I think it's relevant. It's something that Western institutions, like if they want to remain sort of competitive in the currency space, have to look at. Like they need to provide sort of a better product, if you will. But it's not a serious threat to the dominance of the US dollar on all of these three scales, in my opinion.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of things so far, but this bit I was really looking forward to, because it's so nice to talk to someone who actually knows the reality of the situation, and not just saying, BRICS is coming, it's the end of the US order, and well, it's sensationalist rubbish. Just a little bit of statistics here. So currently the USD is about 58% of exchange reserves, and that's been about the same since 2020. It did drop a bit prior to COVID, but interestingly, that deviation away from the dollar, which again is marginal, hasn't gone to non-Western countries. It's gone specifically into the pound, and from what I'm looking at here, the yen, right? So it's still circulating predominantly in Western dominated currencies. The renminbi, while it has reached a high of about 2.8% in 2021, has not, it's only doubled really, and it's teetered around 2.5, 2.3%. And if I remember correctly, in March earlier this year, Reuters produced a report stating that the overall percentage of the reserve currency in China had actually decreased, and it was on a downward trajectory. So this idea that China is sort of going to come through and become the global reserve currency is nonsense. To sort of bring in the Chinese element a little bit more, like, it's not possible because they don't have an open capital account, as per one factor. But sort of, so how can the non-Western countries, I don't know, anti-US axis, try to sort of weaken the US dollar dominance? Or it's just not possible. I'm not gonna start turning this into a Bitcoin discussion, but there are some people who like to push the idea of CBDCs and crypto.
No, I think it's totally possible. You need to be big enough as an economy to do it. So I think the only country that can viably do it at the moment is China. And some of these initiatives, like mBridge or BRICS Bridge or the central bank digital currency initiatives, that go around sort of the correspondent banking model, which means that sort of the US has all of these private banks that basically, like the dollar system is very much a private currency system that of course relies on support from the Fed and other central banks, but it's very much private, sort of based on these private banks. And you could go around that for sure. So I think that's one step through, like, making these central bank digital currency linkages, which makes it very much faster and cheaper to transact in renminbi, for example. So I think that will be a first step, and they're already doing that. But then, as you've said, sort of they at least don't seem to be willing to go to these next steps, which correspond to the variables that I used earlier, which is investability and liquidity. So for investability, they need to open their capital account, as you said. That meaning that you should be able to invest in Chinese stock markets easily, and crucially, you should be able to get your money out again easily as well. As a huge country like Saudi Arabia, for example, right? Like especially. So they can do that, I think. So how to do it? First, offer better payment options. They're already doing that. Then open up your capital account and provide security, or like some sort of law or rule of law, hopefully, to give countries the confidence to invest in your country and know that you are not going to sanction them, because let's face it, China uses sanctions as well, right? Like, they've sanctioned Australia pretty heavily, easily after Australia said some not so nice things about, in China's opinion, the origin of COVID. So the dollar is being undermined to a certain extent by sanctions, but China is also willing to use sanctions. So maybe stop doing that if you want to compete with the dollar, that is. And then finally, provide better liquidity. Now, they're already doing that in the form of these multilateral banking institutions, but they're not willing to do that at all in running a current account deficit. I think if they were to really stimulate domestic consumption, they could save their economy, and then that would automatically translate into not necessarily a current account deficit, but at least less of a current account surplus, and potentially at some point a current account deficit. And then, if they do all of that, they can overtake the dollar, I think. It's just that they don't seem to be willing to take these last two steps.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of political elements involved there, and I always emphasize not bringing in too much of the geopolitics, but I think it's relevant, right? The decision making is the reason why the European Union works is because there's an ideological alignment that backs it. China and Russia have a quite different idea of the world. The thing that keeps them together predominantly is this mutual desire to sort of usurp the US, but they have territorial disputes. There's concerns over China's dominance over Russia's economy increasingly, or the dependency of Russia on China. So I think those are factors. But more specifically, I'm interested in your thoughts about the new development bank as well. The NDB was started in 2013, and I think they've got a reserve currency pool of about 100 billion, which was set up by the original five, but half of that is provided by China itself. South Africa, I think, has committed like literally 1 or 2%. And on top of that is the fact that the World Bank, just the department I worked in for a couple of years, the biggest area, the IBD, if I remember, or is it the IDA? Can't remember the acronym. It's too many. Their annual budget for specific areas of initiatives amount about 90 billion. So we're talking about the entirety of the reserve pool for one bank being 100 billion versus just one subset of the World Bank being almost the same. So, like, how do the BRICS nations sort of leverage their economies to develop this sort of multilateral initiative, or it's not something that's feasible in the current circumstance?
Tricky question, Pyotr. Perhaps I get the sense that you might actually know more about this than I get the sense that you know more about this than I do, to be honest. It makes sense that they try to set up a development bank if they want to have a sort of more dominant currency, for sure. Right? The World Bank and the IMF have probably really helped the dollar to cement its dominance. So it makes sense that they're trying to recreate these institutions. But I would argue that if you're then not willing to go all the way, like doing all the other steps as well, it's not as useful to only do this development bank. I think that's part of the liquidity aspect that I mentioned of how important sort of an international currency can become. But it's only a small part of it. And then if you insist on running huge current account surpluses that drain liquidity from the world again, then it won't work to make your currency a proper alternative to the dollar.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not trying to be too much of a sneaky chap, but got a curveball question occasionally here and there. And again, very simply though, sort of part of the reason why the euro works is because of the regional proximity, literally the geography, right? I just don't know how a common currency share between Russia and Brazil is going to function, right? It's not exactly sort of a feasible thing in my mind, or am I oversimplifying it? And how much is this just China? Let's bring in China a little bit more, because I know that's always in the back of your mind. You like to talk about China, or China. It's not really BRICS; it's China and co. Really.
Yeah, I agree. Of course, you could also argue that it's the same for the US, right? It's like the US and co, where co is Europe and Japan and Korea and Australia. I think you can build an international monetary order if you want, where there's one dominant power, China, and then it has allies that are willing to then use this currency, similar how to the US did it with its allies. That can totally work. But indeed, it depends on the dominant power. It's not realistic, I think, to build a BRICS coin, because as you mentioned, these countries are very, very far away from each other. They only trade with each other in fairly limited quantities compared to the rest of the world. And if they do trade, they run these surpluses or deficits for a long time, meaning that liquidity goes sort of from one country to the other for a very long time. And then you need to have either a big country that's willing to run deficits for a very long time if the others are to be able to run surpluses. Or you need to have maybe an international institution that takes up that role, as the IMF was partially designed to do, but never fully did. And I don't see signs of any of that in the BRICS.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so we touched upon sanctions, and I find it a particularly fascinating area of statecraft, sort of one of the tools in the economic toolbox of nation states. Now, the US is obviously by far the biggest unilateral sanctioning state, and the BRICS is an attempt to sort of, as I've said before, sidestep that. Do you find that sanctions can be a useful tool? Or have they been overutilized? And sort of we're now beginning to see, weaponizing the dollar is just a too much of a risk that the US has pushed too much?
Yeah, I would say both. Clearly, it's been a useful tool. I think if you go back to the history of sanctions, well, it tended to be more sort of like trade embargoes way in the past, and then financial sanctions are fairly new. Very much used on Iran, for example, a couple of decades ago, I think, or a couple of years ago at least, and did a lot of damage. Also used on North Korea. It did a lot of damage. Like North Korea's economy is not very good, partially due to their own fault, but sanctions have reportedly been quite effective on some of these smaller countries. But the thing is, like, you can only understand an economic, you cannot understand economics as being static, right? Like, there's always an action and a counteraction, an action and a counteraction. And I think with sanctions, if they're applied, you will see counteractions trying sanction dodging, and then the sanctions have to be updated again, more sanction dodging, and then it can result in the entire system changing and the sanctions not working anymore, of course. So yes, it's a useful tool, but I guess it's like in that way similar to how warfare works, right? You have this one technology being developed, and then another one is coming in to counter that, and it's always like a game of cat and mouse.
Yeah, for sure. I find it very interesting, as I say, the relationship of warfare to economics, and that's sort of because how one professor told me once, it was sort of you only have really three options. It's either hard power, i.e., traditional military use, diplomacy and soft power and sort of engagement, or a middle road of economic consequences, and sort of you try to do damage or coerce or encourage behavioral change in the target country, but without sort of literally just sending in missiles and rockets, and you try and hit them in the economy. So it's a sort of, but the problem is that it does alienate countries, and I think when the US uses it against even allies or potential partners, it can be risky business. I'm thinking sort of, India for supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine or something like that. That's why the Americans haven't done it. I guess the last question really I'm very interested is China again, which is that China is, as you said in the first part, there is economic tailwinds and the economic headwinds, but sort of that are counteracting against one another. What is your forecast for China, particularly in the short to medium term? Because from what I see in Whitehall, in the UK, or in Washington, or in parts of the European Union, there is either people who are very hawkish on China or bullish in a market sense, or there are people who are quite bearish and thinking it's, oh dear, China's about to collapse. There's a lot of channels on YouTube which are like, oh, China's finished. And then there are people who are like, oh no, China's going to grow and grow and the US is going to be tiny. Where do you see that? You're more positive or not on China's short to medium term?
Yeah, I'm more moderate, but a little bit negative. I've made videos sort of debunking the collapse videos all over YouTube, and my main argument there was always like, yes, they have this huge bubble, but a bubble will only lead to a very big collapse in certain circumstances, such as if you're running a very big current account deficit, or if the government basically lets the system collapse because they want to see sort of economic rejuvenation afterwards, which happened in the Great Depression, for example, in the United States, where they just let the system collapse because that was the economic ideology there. That has very big, I would never do that like completely, but there are some advantages to that approach in the long run, I would argue. But my argument then has always been like, China will not collapse because the government will not let it. Like, they don't have that external vulnerability. They have a big current account surplus, and they will never let all the banks collapse. So the worst that can happen to them is economic stagnation and gradual decline. And of course, that could still happen with some crises and some major declines followed by sort of a move upwards again, or that's what happened to Japan, right? Like, they stagnated. But if you go to the 90s, they had a couple of very serious crises anyways. So I would say, that's why I don't think they will collapse. And the case I made in a very long video about sort of my sort of prediction for China is that they've used this investment-led growth model to really grow very quickly, but that this model is no longer working for them, and that they should transition to sort of the next phase, focusing on services rather than manufacturing, focusing on demand rather than on supply. And they don't seem to be doing that at all. And so I don't think they will easily overcome this crisis. And the stagnation, if I had to bet money on China, I would bet on stagnation. Even though they have some tailwinds, or
Interesting.
still demographically for the next couple of years, and in some of their industries or some of the innovation that they're doing, could still help their economy quite a bit. But yeah, so slightly negative still. Yeah, but with a huge caveat that data from China is very sparse, is very unreliable. So that's my caveat. Like, I don't know, and nobody knows completely how big the bubble actually was. Nobody knows completely how well they're actually doing. So that's my caveat. I base my analysis on the data that I have, on the studies that I have, and based on that, I would say stagnation is most likely.
Well, from my very extreme one-sided perspective to another extreme, you took the middle, and I think stagflation is sort of a good median there, because it means that not much is happening. But I agree very much on the point about the lack of publications of data. They discontinued that, I think, a couple of years ago, around about the time that I read a report that was talking about sort of how China's economy may be actually, much smaller than we think it is. I think it was an academic paper written in Chicago, from the University of Chicago, if I remember correctly. It was a really interesting paper. And sort of,
I made a video about that. Maybe you found it via my video.
Did you make a video on that? Oh, I'll have to go and watch it. Oh, there you go, guys. There's a plug for that video. Go and watch it. I'm going to go and watch it after this. I didn't know you'd done a video on that one. Oh, yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. White China's economy is much smaller than we thought.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you for inviting me, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, it was really nice to have a more economic centric discussion. And everyone, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, then consider subscribing, giving it a like, consider sharing. I need to get better at doing these sorts of plugs and things. But as always, I wish you peace of mind, and I'll see you in the next episode. All right, take care, everyone.